A hammer came down hard against a sheet of rusted iron. It bounced off and nearly took her thumb with it. She swung again, and this time the bolt cracked loose and skittered across the floor. Dust rained down from somewhere above. A dog barked twice and backed away from the noise. She wiped the sweat off her face and pressed one hand flat against her swollen belly. 7 months along, and here she was, swinging a hammer at a dead man's machine. Her name was Nora Vance, and 3 days earlier she had bought this place for $40. Everyone in town said she'd been robbed. A leaking roof, a dome rusted shut, a telescope nobody had touched in 20 years. But that old brass tube was hiding something worth more than the entire county. What did that dead astronomer hide inside it? Stay with me on this one. The county sold whatever nobody else wanted on the courthouse steps: a busted tractor, a dead man's fishing boat, and that Tuesday morning in Flagstaff, a hilltop observatory that hadn't opened its dome since Nixon's first year in office. Nora stood at the back of the crowd with $40 folded in her coat pocket, everything she had in the world. Her husband, Tom, had died in the spring. A logging truck came around a curve outside Winslow, and Tom didn't. Gone before supper, no warning, no goodbye. He left behind a bloodhound named Rufus, a payment book on a trailer she couldn't keep up with, and a baby due in August. She had come to that auction to buy a wood stove. She walked away with a mountain. Here's how it happened. The auctioneer got to the observatory near the end of the list when half the crowd had drifted off to lunch. He read it out like an apology. Cedar Butte Observatory, 1 acre, 1 dome, 1 telescope, condition unknown. Sold as is, where is, no promises. He asked for $50. Nobody moved. He asked for $25. A couple of men laughed. Somebody said you'd have to pay him to haul that eyesore off the hill. And Nora, who had nowhere to sleep after Friday, raised her hand and said $40. The auctioneer looked at her belly. He looked at the men laughing. Then he brought the gavel down before anyone could take pity on her and outbid her out of the roof over her head. Sold, to the young lady in the gray coat. A man beside her leaned in as she signed. He smelled of chewing tobacco, and he meant to be kind. He told her that hill was a graveyard, that the road washed out every spring, that no water line ran up that high and no power either. He told her a woman in her condition had no business alone on a mountain. Nora thanked him for his concern, folded the paper into her coat, and did not change her mind. She had learned that spring that kindness and a warning weigh the same as nothing when you have nowhere else to go. That was the first artifact of this whole story. A yellow carbon receipt, county seal in the corner, $40, paid in full. Nora folded it into her Bible that night, and it stayed there for the rest of her life. The drive up Cedar Butte took 20 minutes on a road that was more idea than road. Rufus rode in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears flapping. When the trees opened up, there it stood. A round stone building with a domed metal roof gone orange with rust. The kind of place children dared each other to visit at night. Inside, it was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The roof leaked in 3 places. Birds had gotten into the upper level. But the walls were thick stone, the floor was solid, and there was a cot, a stove, a sink with a hand pump that still drew cold water. A person could live here. A person had to. And in the center of it all, under the frozen dome, stood the telescope. It was enormous. A great brass tube the length of a car, mounted on an iron frame bolted straight into the bedrock. Even under 20 years of dust and pigeon mess, the brass caught what little light came through the cracks and threw it back gold. Nora stood there with one hand on her belly and just looked at it, and for the first time since the highway outside Winslow, she felt something other than fear. She felt curious. She learned the man's name from a plaque bolted to the base. Elias Crane, astronomer. Below it 2 dates, and the space between them was 71 years. The people in town were happy to fill in the rest. Old Crane, they said, had come out from back east sometime after the First War, built the observatory with his own money, and then simply disappeared into it. He didn't come to church. He came to town but twice a year for salt and lamp oil and photographic supplies. No wife anybody remembered, no children, no visitors. When he died, the sheriff found him at the eyepiece of that telescope, cold, with a blanket over his knees like he just meant to look for another minute. No will, no family to claim him. The county buried him in the pauper's row and locked the door and forgot. 20 years later, a pregnant widow with $40 unlocked it again. That first week nearly broke her. She patched the worst of the roof with tar paper and a prayer. She hauled 20 years of ruin out the door by the bucketful, dead birds and mouse nests, and a rug that had gone to powder. Her back ached, her ankles swelled, and more than once she sat down on the cot and cried until Rufus put his big head in her lap and groaned along with her. She rationed her last money down to pennies. A loaf of bread had to last 4 days. She learned which floorboards would hold, and she learned the sound the wind made coming across the butte at night, a long, low moan through the crack in the dome that took her a week to stop mistaking for a voice. But every morning she got up and worked, because the alternative was to admit the whole town was right about her. And she had decided, somewhere on that highway outside Winslow, that she was done letting other people be right about her. And every day she worked, the telescope watched her. She started cleaning at last, the way you save the good thing for the end. She wiped down the great brass tube inch by inch with a rag and vinegar. She oiled the gears until the stiff ones turned sweet. And when the dome finally cracked open with a shriek of rust and a burst of daylight, she laughed out loud alone on that mountain like a woman half mad. That night, she pointed it at the moon. She didn't know how, not really. She just turned the wheels until the sky slid into focus. And the moon came up in that eyepiece so close and so bright, and so full of shadow and mountain that she gasped and grabbed the frame to keep from falling. Tom would have loved this, she thought. Tom, who could never sit still, who was always driving off somewhere with the windows down. He'd have loved a machine that let you drive all the way to the moon without leaving the mountain. She stood there a long time with her hand on the brass, and for once the grief didn't crush her. It just sat beside her, quiet, and looked up too. She didn't know it yet, but she just looked through the most valuable instrument in the state of Arizona. The dog found it first. That's the part nobody believes, but it's true. It was a cold night in the second week, and Rufus wouldn't settle. He kept getting up, walking to the base of the telescope and scratching at the stone floor. Nora shooed him off twice. The third time she got up to see what had him so worked up. He was scratching at a wooden panel set into the side of the iron mount, down near the base, painted the same dull black as the frame so you'd never notice it. Nora had cleaned right over it a dozen times. She knelt, which at 7 months was its own small adventure, and pressed on the panel. It gave, hollow behind it. She got a screwdriver and worked the edge until the little door popped open on a hidden hinge. Inside was a cavity the size of a bread box. And inside it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, were books, not one, a whole stack. Cloth-bound ledgers, the kind a shopkeeper keeps, their spines cracked with age. Nora pulled them out one at a time, 30 of them, one for every year. She opened the top one and held the lamp close, numbers. Columns and columns of them in a small, careful hand, dates down the left side, times, and beside each one strings of figures that meant nothing to her in little sketches, dots on a grid, arrows, curves, the same shape over and over, drawn a little differently each night, marching slowly across the page from one year to the next. She sat down on the cold floor with the ledgers in her lap and read until the lamp burned low. The man had been watching one thing. That much even she could see. Out of the whole enormous sky, Elias Crane had picked one spot and gone back to it night after night for 30 years. He'd drawn a little wandering point of light, and he'd tracked it as it crept across the stars, and he'd filled 30 books with numbers chasing after it. Whatever it was, it moved. And he had a name for it. He never wrote the long numbers next to it without also writing in the same careful hand a single word. Ren. Nora ran her thumb over the word. Ren. Over and over, 30 years of it. Ren rising in the east. Ren at the meridian. Ren dim tonight, cloud. There were nights he wrote nothing else at all, just the date and the word and a single number, as if he'd come out only to make sure it was still there, the way you check on a sleeping child in the next room. She thought it was the loveliest, saddest thing she'd ever read, though she couldn't have told you why. An old man alone on a mountain, chasing a speck of light he'd named like you'd name a child. She closed the last book gently, the way you close a door on someone sleeping, and then she did what a tired, pregnant woman does at midnight. She decided the mystery was just an old man's grief, and she let it be. She stacked the ledgers on the little table by the cot. She put the kettle on and made a cup of weak tea. She lowered herself into the one good chair and put her swollen feet up on a crate. Rufus circled twice and dropped down beside her with a sigh, his job apparently done. The wind moved soft against the dome. The kettle ticked as it cooled. For the first time in months, Nora Vance felt something close to peace. A roof, a warm cup, a dog, a baby turning slow under her ribs, and a sad, sweet story to keep her company. That was enough. That was plenty. She let her eyes fall shut and thought, tomorrow I'll clean the west window, and she believed with her whole heart that the hard part was behind her. It wasn't. It was just getting started. The knock came at 8 the next morning, and it was not a friendly knock. 3 hard raps, the kind a man gives a door he expects to open. Rufus was on his feet growling before Nora even set down her cup. She opened the door to a man in a good gray suit that had no business on a mountain, holding a leather folder, and behind him, halfway down the path, 2 more men waiting by a black car she hadn't heard drive up. The man in the suit smiled the way a hook smiles at a fish. He said his name was Mr. Delane, and he represented certain interests, and he understood the county had made an unfortunate error in a recent sale. He was here, he said, to correct it. He told her the observatory should never have gone to auction. There was a question about the deed, about old Crane's estate, about whether the county had the right to sell at all. He said it kindly, the way you tell a child the toy was never really theirs, and his interests were prepared to be generous. $200 cash today, and she could walk away with more money than she came with and no trouble at all. Now here's the thing. Nora was tired and pregnant and alone on a mountain, and $200 was more money than she'd seen in a year. It would have paid off the trailer. It would have bought a crib and a winter's worth of food and a bus ticket to somewhere with a doctor down the street. For one long breath she wanted to take it, but she'd spent her whole life reading men who wanted something from her, and this man wanted something bad. You don't send 3 men and a black car up a broken road to buy a leaking roof out of kindness. And you don't offer a widow $200 for a thing you just called worthless. So she asked him a simple question. If the place was worthless, why did he want it? His smile slipped just for a second, and in that second she saw it. Fear. He was afraid she already knew, and that told her more than any deed. Behind him, one of the men by the car shifted his weight and looked up at her, and Nora understood, standing there in the doorway, that these men had not come all this way to be told no. She said no anyway. She said the deed was in her Bible and the county seal was on it, and if he had a problem with the sale, he could take it up with a judge. Then she shut the door in his face, threw the bolt, and stood there with her heart going like a hammer while Rufus barked the car all the way down the mountain. She spent that whole day with the ledgers. She couldn't read the math, but she could read a man. She went back through the 30 books, looking not at the numbers now, but at the words, the little notes Crane had let slip in the margins. And slowly the story came up out of the pages like a photograph in a tray. In the early books he was careful and formal, a man keeping a record. But as the years piled up, the notes changed. He started talking to it. "Steady tonight," he wrote once. "And another time, forgive me, 3 nights of cloud, I feared I'd lost you." She read a man growing older across those pages, his hand getting shakier, and through all of it the same faithful climb up the dome stairs to check on the same small light. Wren was not a star. Crane had written it plain once in a shaking hand near the end of book 28. Wren is no star. Wren is a body, and she is coming home. He tracked its path around the sun for 30 years and drawn the whole great loop of it, and his numbers said the loop was tightening and the thing was going to pass near the earth. Not to hit it, he wrote, to pass. Close and bright and brief. But that wasn't the part that made her sit up. The part that made her sit up was 3 pages later, where Crane had written about the light. He'd done something clever with his telescope. He'd split Wren's light through a prism, the way you split sunlight into a rainbow, and he'd read the colors, and the colors told him what the thing was made of. And what it was made of was metal, nearly all of it. Iron and nickel, and threaded all through it in lines Crane had underlined 3 times the metals of kings, platinum, and what he called the sister metals, the ones rarer than gold. He'd written 1 line under that, and Nora read it a dozen times. A mountain of it. A whole silver mountain, falling toward us out of the dark, and no one alive knows but me. That's when it hit her what she was holding. And that's when it hit her why a man in a gray suit had come up her mountain with $200 and a lie about the deed. Somebody had gotten wind of old Crane's secret. Not the whole of it, maybe, but enough to know that hilltop and that telescope and those books were worth chasing. And they'd come to take it from a woman they figured couldn't fight back. She sat there a long while with her hand on her belly and did the hard arithmetic of her situation. She had 40 cents, a bad road, no telephone, and a baby coming. They had a car and lawyers and time. By every measure that usually counts, she had already lost. But she had the books, and she had the receipt. And she was starting to understand that those 2 things in the right hands were heavier than any black car. If you're still with me this far, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button, because what Nora did next is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this story. She didn't run and she didn't sell. She went to town. She drove down to the little college on the edge of Flagstaff, the one with the small astronomy department, and she asked, plain as day, for anyone who could read a set of numbers. A secretary tried to turn her away. Nora set one of the ledgers on the counter and opened it and said, "Then tell me what these are, and if it's nothing I'll leave and never come back." The secretary looked at the page, and something in it made her go quiet, and she picked up the phone. They sent her to a young professor named Daniel Ott, 30 years old, patched elbows, who took one look at Crane's ledgers and forgot how to breathe. He turned the pages slow, and his hand started to shake, and he looked up at her with tears standing in his eyes. He said, "Do you know what this is?" He said this man discovered an object, tracked it for a human lifetime, computed its orbit and read its spectrum alone with no help and no credit, and he told nobody. And then he said the thing that changed everything. He said, and it's dated, every observation is dated and signed. Discovery belongs to whoever saw it first and can prove it. Elias Crane saw it first, and you own his proof. But Daniel also told her the hard truth. He said the men in the gray suits were almost certainly from a mining and aerospace concern out of California, the kind that had started sniffing around the idea of what fortunes might be floating in the sky. They had money enough to buy judges and patience enough to wait her out. If they got these books, they'd bury Crane's name, claim the discovery through their own people, and take the whole thing. He said the value, if that spectrum was right, if that much metal really was up there and reachable, was beyond anything he could put a number to. Hundreds of millions easy, maybe more. And he said something else. He leaned across the desk and lowered his voice, and he said, "Whoever's chasing you already knows the books exist. They will not stop and they will not fight fair, because fair is the one thing they can't afford. You need to make this public fast, and you need to do it in Crane's name, or they'll take both the money and the man. Once it's printed in front of the whole country, it's out of a locked box and into the open, and they can't put it back." Nora asked how long it would take. He said the newspaper could run it in a day, and the college president would want it, and the national people would follow within a week. She asked what she was supposed to do until then. Daniel didn't have an answer. They both knew a week was a long time on a dark mountain with no telephone and a black car that knew the way up. They came back that night. Nora saw the headlights climbing the mountain, and she knew. She sent Daniel out the back with 2 of the ledgers and half the pages photographed, told him to drive to the newspaper and the college president and not to stop for anything, not for a stop sign, not for a red light, not if he saw those headlights in his mirror. He didn't want to leave her. She told him the books were worth more than the widow, and that was the truth, and they both knew it, and he went. She kept the rest. She kept the receipt in the Bible. She kept Rufus at her side. And she stood in the doorway of that observatory, 7 months pregnant, and waited. Delane didn't bother knocking this time. He came in with the 2 men behind him, and his smile was gone. He said she'd had her chance to be reasonable. He said accidents happen to women alone on mountains, and nobody would think twice about a widow and a bad road and a dark night. He held out a paper and a pen and told her to sign the deed over, and this time he didn't mention the $200. Now I want you to picture this, because it's the whole story right here. A dark stone room. A rusted telescope pointed at a hole in the roof. 1 woman, 1 old dog, 3 men, and a fortune nobody could see hanging in the sky over all their heads. Nora did not sign. She told him she knew what Wren was. She said it out loud, the metal, the orbit, the whole of it, and she watched the fear come back into his face, because now he knew she knew everything. And then she told him the thing that beat him. She told him it was already gone. A professor was standing in the offices of the Arizona Daily Sun at that very minute with the numbers and the photographs and Elias Crane's name. And by morning the whole country would know an old man on a mountain had found a silver world in the sky, and that the widow he was threatening owned every page of the proof. She said, "You can take these books off my dead body if you want, but you're already too late to take his name off them. Killing me tonight doesn't buy you a thing, except a rope." For a long moment nobody moved. Delane looked at her belly and at the dog and at the door, and she watched him do the math a coward does. The risk. The witnesses now, a professor and a newspaper and a printing press already turning. The story running downhill toward morning where he couldn't reach it. Hurting her wouldn't get the discovery back. It would only hang a murder around his neck for nothing, and men like Delane never do anything for nothing. He lowered the paper. He said something ugly and low. And then he turned and walked out, and his 2 men followed, and the black car went down the mountain and out of her life for good. She never saw him again. Nora bolted the door and slid down it to the floor and shook. Rufus climbed half into her lap, and up through the open dome, if she'd looked, in a patch of stars over Cedar Butte, a speck of light was doing exactly what a dead man had said it would. Coming home. The morning paper carried it above the fold. Recluse astronomer's secret discovery. A silver world in the sky. And Nora made the young professor promise her one thing before he let them print a single word. The name. It had to keep the name, because by then she understood why Elias Crane had hidden it. She'd found the last thing in the last ledger, tucked behind the back cover, and it wasn't math. It was a photograph, brown with age. A young woman with dark hair, laughing, and in her arms a baby wrapped in white. On the back, in that same careful hand, 2 names and 1 date. Margaret and Wren Crane, and under it 4 words, both lost, same night. That was the whole of it. Elias Crane had once had a wife named Margaret and a daughter named Wren, and he had lost them both on the same night the child was born, and he had climbed a mountain and pointed a telescope at the dark because he could not bear to look at the ground where they were buried. And when he found that wandering speck of metal and light out in the cold, he had named it after his little girl, and he had spent 30 years keeping her company, watching her come home. He never told anybody because it was never about the money. If he'd told the world would have taken his discovery and given it some catalog number, a string of digits, the way the world does, and his daughter would have vanished a second time. So he kept her secret and safe in 30 books behind a hidden door, and he sat at the eyepiece with a blanket over his knees, watching over her, until the night he simply didn't get up. Nora, who was carrying a child of her own and had buried a husband of her own, understood that better than anyone alive. And she decided that whatever it cost her, whatever fortune was hanging up there in the dark, the little girl was keeping her name. It took 2 years and a fight, but she won it. The discovery was confirmed. The spectrum was real. The metal was real, more of it than the Earth could dream of. And when the estimators finally put a number on what that silver world was worth, the figure they printed was $520 million. And because Elias Crane died with no kin, and because a pregnant widow had bought his observatory and his books and his secret for $40 at a county auction, fair and legal, county seal and all, the law said the proof and the discovery and everything that flowed from it belonged to Nora Vance. She did not keep it for herself, not most of it. She set up a foundation, and she gave the mountain and the great brass telescope to the young professor's college on one condition, that it be run forever as a place where anyone, rich or poor, credentialed or not, could come and look at the sky. She fixed the roof. She fixed the dome. And she put a new plaque on the base of the telescope beside the old one, and it did not have her name on it. It had 2 names. Elias Crane, who found her, and Wren Crane, who came home. The object itself, that silver mountain falling slow around the sun, it kept its name too. Nora made sure of that. In every catalog and every book past the numbers and the digits, it is called Wren. A little girl who lived one night on the earth has her name written on a world of metal that will outlast every one of us. Nora's baby came in August, in the middle of a heat wave in the hospital down in Flagstaff. A girl. She named her Margaret after the mother in the photograph, and she raised her on that mountain in a stone house with a good roof and a warm stove and an old bloodhound who lived, against all odds, to see the child learn to walk. And on clear nights when the girl was old enough, Nora would open the great dome with a crank that no longer shrieked and lift her daughter up to the eyepiece, and together they would find the wandering light. She'd tell her the whole story, the auction and the $40 and the dog scratching at the hidden door, and the man in the gray suit, and the old astronomer with the blanket over his knees. And every time she got to the end, she'd say the same thing. Some men, she'd say, love so hard that even the dark can't hold it. He didn't hide a fortune up here, sweetheart. He hid his little girl, and he waited 30 years for her to come home. We just kept the porch light on. It started with a hammer swinging at a dead man's machine, a pregnant woman with nothing, alone on a mountain everyone had laughed at. It ended with her daughter's small eye pressed to the brass, looking up at a name that will never be erased, held safe in the sky by a man who never gave up on the people he lost. $40. That's all it cost her. $40, and the willingness to see what everyone else had thrown away. And that, my friend, is the whole reason I wanted you to stay with me on this one.